And then the other caveat I want to give is when I get excited about a topic, like I am about this topic, I have a tendency to stutter. I'm a stutterer. It's genetic, right? So if I start stuttering, just know it's because I'm so excited about this topic of attending to silence voices in ethics, and want to just say it's not just in ethics; it's in healthcare and broader. Next slide, please. So I want to start off with some disclosures. I'll let you all read the disclosures. But I do want to ask that, in academia and beyond, we have a tendency we're thinking quickly, we're multitasking, we're doing multiple things. And part of attending to silence voices is setting aside all of the busyness that we have. And so would like to invite you all to just be present in this time that we have together, to not be checking emails, to not be, texting, to not be like all of the things that all of us have a tendency to do, myself included. But as we are attending to silence voices, my hope is that we can remain engaged. And I want to say that, this presentation may feel very challenging and uncomfortable. It includes concepts and ideas rooted in racism and colonialism. And I'm going to admit to you all, you may hear my voice shake a little bit, right? I'm uncomfortable myself, and I'm feeling quite vulnerable in front of all of you talking about these topics. And yet, because of who I am, because of my history, because of my lineage, I must talk about what needs to be acknowledged. I want to encourage you all to do what you need to do to take care of yourself, whatever that looks like for you, right? And while caring for yourself, I also invite you to reflect on why there may be discomfort present. This isn't about shaming or calling out any group of people, especially us in the ethics space. This is about acknowledging and considering ways we can do better as a field. And I truly believe that it is through these types of conversations and in not shutting down the discomfort that we can truly move forward together in community. I want to especially say to my Black and Brown relatives, I really, really, we're going to be talking about settler colonialism. We're going to be talking about colonization. We're going to be talking about white supremacy, for you to especially take care during this talk. And I also want to take a moment to just recognize that in our current national climate, that some of these concepts and ideas are at best being ignored and at worst extinguished. And that doesn't change the fact that they exist. Next slide, please. So prior to George Floyd's widely transmitted around the world murder on May 25th, 2020, ethicists that I know, love, and deeply respect believed that as ethicists, to be just, we must remain impartial, that we must remain focused on the ethical principles, on the foundations of the field, right? Mostly developed by incredibly intelligent people whose voices have not been silenced or had not been silenced, and many of whom do not have racialized, excluded, or marginalized identities, or the intersections of those identities. This was prevalent in ethics discourse across the national landscape. And as a person with multiple intersecting identities that are often silenced, I and many others pushed back. Why is impartiality a core aspect of the justice principle among many other ethical principles in discourse? Is impartiality realistic when it comes to oppression, of colonialism, and oppression and colonialism and white supremacy? Those are pools that literally each and every one of us swim in, whether we're aware that we're swimming in it or not. I and many others had so many questions, and this is when I wrote this ethical mandate that you see on the screen. I was angry, I was devastated, I was exhausted to the core of my being. Why is it okay that some voices are silenced and others are elevated? How are we as a field not understanding that this must be a place for us as ethicists to engage at a deeper level, to no longer be impartial, but to empower and elevate silenced voices? George Floyd's voice was the horrific embodiment of silenced voices as he called for his mama and strained repeatedly, saying, "I can't breathe." Literally, his voice, the voice of a Black man in America, was being silenced through a knee on his neck, with his perpetrator having zero regard for the silencing that was occurring. I had so many questions in my rage, and in my soul sorrow, and in my grief. How is racism not an ethical issue? Why aren't we as ethicists being louder? Why aren't we naming the injustices that are occurring because of racism and other oppressions? Why are we being complicit and not using our voices and privilege? I knew we could do better. And I'm happy to say that we are doing better, and yet we still have so far to go. Voices such as Dr. Keisha Ray, Dr. Jennifer James, Dr. Crystal Tsosi, Joanna Suarez, and other Black, Indigenous, Latine, and queer scholars from around the world who, prior to George Floyd's snuffed out and permanently silenced voice, had been raising our voices in this space and continue to name the deeply uncomfortable. We continue to what sometimes felt like screaming from the mountaintop into an empty abyss. Racism and oppression is and should be ethical issues. We as ethicists can no longer be impartial to silenced voices. And I want to name that our issues, the issues of those of us with racialized, excluded, marginalized, silenced voices are not the same, but rather intersect with the umbrella of feminist ethics, which is also incredibly important. We need to have our own umbrella. We have distinct ethical needs that center our voices as humans and as scholars. How are the principles applied or even weaponized at times against silenced voices, including our own? The collective we have been naming this for as long as we have existed, for as long as modern ethics has existed. We too, our voices, which have oftentimes been silenced within the field, they matter too. And finally, after 8 minutes and 46 seconds of televised brutality, we were starting to gain more traction and be heard. Of course, there have been voices before us, but as a field, we mostly stayed in that impartial space apart from a few loud voices. It's well past time to examine our discipline with a critical eye in order to truly engage in justice and equity. Next slide, please. And I know that, like, as we're going through this, some of these images are difficult. They're challenging. And I, again, want to encourage us all to stay in that space of discomfort. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who may or may not have been known as an ethicist per se, he was deeply committed to attending to silenced voices. And he said, "I agree with Dante that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a period of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. There comes a time when silence becomes betrayal." Are impartiality and neutrality the same thing? And honestly, when I was preparing this talk earlier in the summer, I needed some levity. And so I put a question into our newish and, for me, suspect, quote unquote, friend, ChatGPT. What is the difference between impartiality and neutrality? They said, impartiality is about fairness and equal treatment, while neutrality is about non-involvement or abstention from taking a position. I don't agree with them. As humans, can we truly be fair and equal or impartial in all circumstances without engaging in neutrality? And I often wonder if impartiality is another form of colorblindness, which we have learned over time silences voices and identities of marginalized and excluded people, especially those of us with racialized identities. How does justice, a core principle in bioethics, include impartiality? How can we be impartial when, in fairness, equity, treatment of human beings, seems to be incongruent with impartiality. If impartiality is a tenet of justice, this is not a principle that I can adhere to in the way that we think about it in ethics. And honestly, I don't think that Dr. King could have either. And I can understand where it may be easy for those of us who don't have the lived experiences of being someone with an excluded, racialized, or marginalized identity to name the benefits of impartiality and justice. The reality is that with the biases that we hold, biases, aka racism, sexism, colonialism, so on and so forth, that we hold as humans, that none of us can truly be impartial. So I ask the question, is it moral to be impartial in attending to silence voices? And to those of us who have been affected by racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, and so many more isms, is it truly justice? Have we shown up as a field, or have we contributed to the epistemic injustices and other injustices through maintaining impartiality, which can exclude and often does exclude the voices of some while extolling or centering the voices of others? Next slide, please. So again, what does this have to do with ethics attending to silenced voices? And I'm going to get there, I promise. But first, I want to talk about a word that has been quite watered down in our society recently: decolonize. Let's decolonize this, let's decolonize that. Abercrombie and Fitch or whoever is selling decolonized t-shirts. But decolonization is a very thoughtful and intentional process. And I'm going to intentionally share with you all how I think about this word, because next I'm going to use land acknowledgments as an example of how good intention may unintentionally silence voices. So this is how I think about decolonize, or to decolonize. It is intentional actions to dismantle the systems of colonization and white supremacy in all aspects of society, including medicine and healthcare, education and academia. And this involves intentional deconstruction of, and at times completely dismantling, the policies, procedures, and colonizing practices and thinking that are so deeply entrenched in these systems. And dare I say that this doesn't just mean them out there, right? But it also means us too, as ethicists. To decolonize requires deep personal reflection and intentional pushback and movement within systems that are designed to protect themselves. It requires identifying and eradicating white supremacy where it is implicitly and explicitly wielded to maintain systems of oppression that are not inclusive of the values, beliefs, mores, rituals, and ways of being that racialized, excluded, and marginalized people and communities valued, or value, not just valued. And I just want to make a note here and say that when I'm talking about white supremacy, I'm not talking about individual people, right? I'm talking about how it is about how whose voices are centered in the creation and continuation of our society, and that it is the scaffolding in which oppression exists. Next slide, please. So for us to think about this, right? We're talking about critically examining ourselves and our behaviors. So I want to use land acknowledgments as an example. Let's discuss and reflect on whose voices are elevated and whose are silenced, as well as what I believe is the responsibility of ethicists to lead by example and elevate silenced voices. So just a little plug that if you want to know who the original pre-colonial inhabitants of the land that you live and work on, a great resource is native-land.ca. And I have no affiliation with this resource, but I use it frequently when giving talks around the country. And it can also be used to find out the same information internationally, but it is primarily focused on Turtle Island, also known as North America. And if you feel called to or you feel like it, as I continue to share in this presentation, please use native-land.ca to look up whose land you live and work on. And they may be different. You may live on one relative's land and you may work on another relative's land. So think about it in that way. And feel free to drop them in the chat. And thank you, Carrie, for putting the link in the chat there. Next slide, please. So what about land acknowledgments? Do they lift up or silence the voices of humans who have lived and cared for this land, Turtle Island, as a direct, who it was taken from as a direct result of colonization? They've lived here for tens of thousands of years pre-colonization. Is it ethical that we distill the voices, the contributions of whole groups of humans, of tribes, of values, of ethics, down to a 2-minute, if that, acknowledgement of their existence that has almost been completely decimated through national policies and procedures in the name of what is right? Is it just? Does it center equity? The brutal realities that exist for Indigenous people on Turtle Island that led to our use of land acknowledgements, the Trail of Tears, of which my Choctaw ancestors were a part of concentration camps, also known as residential or boarding schools, Andrew Jackson's genocidal Indian Removal Act, or Richard Henry Pratt's campaign of kill the Indian, save the man, through founding of residential schools to assimilate Native children into white culture. Do land acknowledgement do they right those wrongs? Do they really attend to the millions upon millions of permanently silenced voices? The Holocaust Museum in Houston, Texas estimates that there were more than 10 million Native Americans on Turtle Island pre-colonization, with estimates of 80 to 95% reduction of our population post-colonization. 80 to 95% reduction. And I just want us to sit with that for a moment. It's appalling. Is it justice or ethical how that 30-second, 90-second, 2-minute land acknowledgement does or doesn't center justice and equity that for those of us who have been silenced throughout history and continue to be silenced today? Next slide, please. So in the context of land acknowledgements and an application of acknowledging all silenced and oppressed voices, in order to not be virtue signaling, which is empty and hollow, land acknowledgements must be more than just a checkbox that is read quickly at the beginning of a presentation, meeting, or conference. In the PBS analysis that you see here on the screen, how well-meaning land acknowledgements can erase Indigenous people and sanitize history, the authors state, after acknowledging that an institution sits on another's land, there is no plan for follow-up, and that plans are almost never articulated to give the land back, and that the implication is what was once yours is now ours. How is this centering justice and equity? I don't have an answer for that. So my request, if you're going to do a land acknowledgement, that you slow down, that you pause, and that you truly give the acknowledgement, the gravitas that the Indigenous people who have lived and cared for Turtle Island for thousands of years pre-colonization deserve. And I want to ask that you commit to an action such as paying real rent or supporting the land back movement financially or in action. So as a Black Native woman, I want to acknowledge and express gratitude to the first people of this land called Seattle by white settlers, right? So today, we're on the ancestral land of the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Puyallup, the Skokomish, the Muckleshoot, and many, many others collectively who make up the Salish people. And it's important to remember that it was through very targeted genocidal campaigns, like we talked about earlier with Andrew Jackson's genocidal campaign, right? That the original inhabitants of this land, not just here in Seattle, but in all of Turtle Island, were violently pushed out of their ancestral homelands. And we need to remember that they are still here, that they are resilient, that they are strong, and that they continue to, or rather, I should say, we continue to carry on the history and traditions of our ancestors and caring for the land. And I want to specifically point out that the Duwamish people still do not have federal recognition. And that recognition system is rooted in settler colonialism, intentionally built divide and determine how resources are disseminated, not just how they're disseminated, but who they're disseminated to. Next slide, please. So as we're thinking about this, right, this is heavy. This is very heavy. It's very heavy on my soul and on my being. What can we do as ethicists, right? We do what we are quite skilled at, things that we may be more comfortable with, right? In attending to silenced voices, we ask the uncomfortable questions. We utilize our foundational principles and tools to determine the answer. And it's not necessarily the answer, right? But it's an answer to an ethical question. It's an answer of what may be acceptable or not. And I still ask the question, I always ask the question, acceptable to whom? But that's a whole other talk for a whole other different day. As ethicists, we are prepared to sit in that liminal space that can cause so much discomfort in many ways for most. This is inclusive of us. We model what Dr. Jennifer James, what Dr. Keisha Ray, and many others have shown us. Silenced voices, we belong in ethical spaces. Black, queer, Indigenous ethics, and other communities who value the collective versus the individual perspective. We belong. We listen to the voices of those with the lived experiences. It's not a philosophical debate for us, right? It's literally our lives. As ethicists, we name the hard things. We say, the way that we are treating this situation seems to be rooted in, and we name the oppression, colonialism, white supremacy, right? We center the voices of those who are doing the labor of the work. And I use our colleagues whose labor and experiences we include in our scholarship, right, that centers our voices as experts. So I'm talking about like our clinical research associates, right, our research coordinators who work on our projects. We include them in our publications at minimum through acknowledging their labor or including them as authors. And after all, a lot of the data that gets collected in our scholarship is due to their labor. So a couple of ethicists that I know, Dr. Doug Opel and Dr. Alex Olszewski, they talk about how excluding research coordinators and others can unintentionally silence voices. In our organizations, this may be this may feel like a big leap for us all, right? Myself included. In our organizations, we bring forward mandates to our leadership, right? Rather than that brief checkbox at the beginning of a presentation, how about we, our organizations, pay real rent for the land upon which the organization sits, right? The land that we're acknowledging in those quick land acknowledgments as stolen land. Wouldn't that bring to life the justice principle, right? Imagine if our organizations were paying real rent to the Duwamish, right? Not just naming that our institution sits on the traditional land of the, right? And that's kind of the quickness in which we do this, because we do a lot of things in quickness. Next slide, please. So how do we, as ethicists, lead the way in elevating silenced voices? I promise we're going to get away from the heavy in a minute here. So as ethicists, we start with ourselves personally and through critically interrogating the foundations of our field. We ask the question, whose voices have been and continue to be lifted in the discourse, in the scholarship, and whose voices are silenced? When contemplating consults, right? Or sorry, when completing consults, we pause and we start with naming our own biases. We withhold judgment and we practice openness, even if it counters what we are quote unquote experts on. We acknowledge the historical and ongoing harms of our organizations and honestly, potentially our scholarship. We step aside and we approach our work with humility. We ask ourselves questions. What change am I hoping to make? Who will or won't be impacted by this change? Who benefits from this change? Should I be leading the change, right? Should I be the one who's leading this change? And regardless of the answers to these questions, we need to pause and ask, who should I be collaborating with? Whose voices are missing? And how can I elevate justice and equity using my own standing in the field? We acknowledge how the paradigm of white supremacy was intentionally developed through colonization, and it encompasses all forms of oppression. It's inherent in our society, including how we are educated in the Western world. We acknowledge that we have all been socialized in this paradigm, even those of us with racialized, marginalized, and excluded identities. We learn how to identify it being white supremacy, and we commit to naming it as a start, even if we can only start with acknowledging it to ourselves. We don't have to use the words white supremacy, right, which can be quite triggering in the true sense of the phrase, but rather we can say things like, I'm noticing that we are talking about a group of people who have been racialized, excluded, and or marginalized. How do we attend to these voices, to those voices? What community or communities do we need to bring in? And we remember to not ask for free labor, but to compensate for the identity tax that people with racialized, marginalized, and or excluded identities pay on a regular basis. The other thing that we do is we get out of our own way. We don't distance ourselves with over intellectualizing the lived experiences of other humans or groups of humans, especially those experiences in which we don't have a lived experience in, or experiences that don't fit neatly into our principles, both personally and as ethicists. We acknowledge that we can no longer be silent, such as that acknowledgement of how impartiality can diminish justice and equity. We refuse to be impartial about profound injustices in much the way that began to happen in our field post George Floyd's murder. We don't become complacent. We don't become complicit. We remain engaged, even when it is so hard or so uncomfortable that we can barely stand it. You know, that discomfort where your nerves are stretched, taut, almost to the point of breaking, right? We still remain engaged. We continue to speak up and we continue to speak out. We continue to elevate, or we start to elevate silenced voices, including at times our own silenced voices. And we do what Ms. Maggie Kuhn, who was a Grey Panther, she advises us to speak even if our voices shake. And as our feminist, our Black, our Indigenous, and our queer colleagues, and so many others have done throughout history, we continue to do this because our existence doesn't allow for a choice for us not to. So I promised that we were going to get a little bit out of the heavy space, and so I'm just going to bring the discomfort down a little bit. Next slide, please. So many of you may know my dear colleague, our dear colleague, Dr. Gina Campelia. And so I want to acknowledge that some of the next slides that I'm going to be talking about are Gina's from a presentation that she and I have done together. And Gina's wasn't available today because she's teaching medical students. So I've taken the liberty on some of these slides. I've made some small changes, but overall, what we're going to be looking at comes from Dr. Campelia. Next slide, please. So we recognize voices in bioethics, right? We recognize the marginalized, excluded, racialized identities. You know, because as ethicists, we hold a lot of expertise. We contribute greatly to our communities, to our organizations and beyond. And we also, hopefully, we show up with humility in recognizing the limits of our expertise. We build trust with patients, with families, with our organizations, while also holding space for disagreement on really complicated moral dilemmas. And our expertise as ethicists relies on us being up to date on research and scholarship, and being responsive to the communities that we serve. Gina put together this slide, which is a bunch of books that are in the ethics space that aren't written by, right, cisgender white men and women. So we recognize this work that's out there. And there's a lot of this contemporary work that is happening. I mentioned some of the scholars earlier who are attending to this work. And we recognize the voices that have been marginalized in ethics and in bioethics, right? The voices expand our vision and push ourselves into spaces where we may not be, actually, we're most likely not going to be the experts. Next slide, please. We also need to recognize that these voices, they're not new, right? They have been there for a long time, and they've been intentionally or unintentionally silenced within our field. Sometimes work on expanding the standards of bioethics is treated as if these voices have newly arrived in the discourse, but they aren't new. They've been here all along, but because they didn't fit into what we believe to be true, they were, and sometimes continue to be, oftentimes I would say continue to remain silenced. Next slide, please. So what should we do now, right? There are frameworks out there for thinking about how to do this in bioethics as a whole, which include community partnerships and collaborations, inclusive scholarship and research, education and training. And on this slide, Gina had shared an example. Next slide, please. So for recognition in healthcare ethics, consultation, and beyond, how do we take things that are happening in the field generally and apply them in ethics, right? There's many levels to do this. There's the space that ethics exists within. Who are we serving? Is it our own egos in which we may sit around and philosophize? Is it the greater good? Is it the silenced voices? How are we identifying core ethical dilemmas and questions and our responses to them? Right? There's how we practice at the bedside, including our training, the policies, and the standard practices. And then there's how we support organizational policy, right? So I dared to name that maybe our organizations should be paying real rent, not just doing a brief land acknowledgement, right? Like, again, what if that was policy? As well, of course, in research and teaching. And then there's how we collaborate and truly listen to silenced voices. And again, I don't know that I can say this enough. We remain engaged, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Discomfort can be the learning edge that allows continued growth and adjustment as needed within the field. Next slide, please. And then here's some inclusive relational structures within healthcare clinical ethics consultation specifically. And it's a way, these are ways that we as ethicists can attend to, continue or start to attend to silenced voices, right? What does our representation on our ethics committees look like, right? Who's present, who's not present? Who do we invite? Who do we not invite, right? So we examine our own internalized biases. We think about community relationship building, right? So not just within our spaces as organizations, but outside of our organizations. We look at inclusivity in case and policy review, right? Like how are we talking about the cases that we're talking about? And then we think about whose voices to bring in paid, or to pay, whose voices to pay for collaboration in our research and scholarship. And I know that in these times that can be difficult to do. And how do we adjust our language so that we can bring in those silenced voices in collaboration? Next slide, please. So additionally, we attend to silence voices again through inclusive analysis and continued critical analysis of ourselves as a field. And again, something I don't think I can say enough. Who's missing from the discourse? Whose voices have been historically silenced? Where are the queer, Black, brown, female, and other silenced voices centered in ethics? And are we paying attention to those voices, or are we dismissing them out of hand because they may challenge us and or make us feel uncomfortable? Next slide. We're almost at the finish line. A few more slides. So we can do this work in how we gather our information during consultation, right? So we think about, go ahead and advance forward. This is going to be one of those slides that is all fancy. Right? We can think about the 4 boxes on their own. Do they or don't they necessarily include targeted questions about how discrimination and oppression might affect the information that is collected in the various boxes, right? We can add questions to these boxes to do this better. We can use the boxes as a foundation to build upon, how we center silenced voices, or do we completely reinvent what the 4 boxes look like, right? A couple more there, a couple more questions. So, and I know we're going quickly through these, but you will get a PDF of the slides. Next slide, please. So, as a Black Indigenous person, I wonder, what if our ethical analysis was a circle, much like the medicine wheel, right, versus the 4-box method? This could recognize that the work that we do is inclusive of all voices, including the patient's voice, rather than a tool that could potentially literally box silenced voices in. In many Indigenous cultures, the medicine wheel symbolizes interconnectedness of life that promotes balance in the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects of our existence as humans. And this is just a couple of examples about how our colleagues in other disciplines have been thinking about how the medicine wheel could be used. And so I want for us to think about, right, what about us in ethics? Are there other methods that we could use besides the medicine wheel that centers that interconnectedness that so many racialized, excluded, and marginalized folks have within our communities? Next slide, please. So imagine these concepts that are here on this screen fitting into the aforementioned medicine wheel, right? So could we go back to the medicine wheel real quick and then come back to this slide? So thinking about the medicine wheel, right, as incorporating the physical, the mental, the spiritual, the emotional, right? Thinking about that interconnectedness as we recognize these aspects of ethics. Next slide, please. So the transformation occurs through the expansion, the inclusion, and the recognition of power and privilege, right? Through opening ourselves up as ethicists to other mechanisms through which to view our roles. So, for instance, let's consider the consequences. So consequentialism, I always struggle with the big words with my stuttering, considers the benefits and harms in broad sense, but often focuses on how different interventions will affect the particular patient. It's possible that I want first to consider this, right? Is it possible that in centering patient well-being, that we could simultaneously marginalize or obscure the consequences to the family or the patient as part of this family, right? So again, thinking about that interconnectedness, how do we identify and address that as ethicists? Next slide, please. So trying to leave us with a little bit of levity here. So we must ask how that power and privilege affects what counts as relevant consequences, and how those consequences are weighed against one another. How do we apply our principles in circumstances in which collectivism is valued over individualism, right? So this cartoon, right? He alone can fix it. I would change it to they alone can fix it. And then the other side saying, we together can fix it. And I really believe that as ethicists, that we can fix it together, that we can fix it collectively, that we can center silenced voices in all of the work that we do, whether it's in scholarship, whether it's in teaching, and whether it's in clinical application. And so I want to leave you with this quote by Bell Hooks. To be truly visionary, sorry, I forgot to say next slide, sorry. To be truly visionary, we have to root our imagination in our concrete reality while simultaneously imagining possibilities beyond that reality. So let's think about this. Let's reflect on this. We have a few minutes left together. And then, Carrie, do you mind just taking the slides down? Ooh, and I'm highlighted here. So all I see is myself. So I'm going to change my view here. Um, but as you're thinking about this last 45 minutes of listening to me talk, I can't wait to hear you all talk, to hear your reflections on this. Um, what are you thinking? What's coming up for you? What needs to be named? Whose voices need to be centered? And so on and so forth. And I would love to see your face if you speak, if you're able to.
This is an open discussion, so feel free to unmute yourselves or come onto video and speak, or you can also just use the chat function and I can read your question aloud if you'd like.
Can I just start speaking? Or no?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Hi, my name's Adlai. I'm one of the radiology residents.